friend, Emily, who used to live in my apartment building with her mother. She now lives across the street from me, and he thought it would be a swell idea if we met, because apparently we are very similar, and I was single and ready to mingle at that point in my life. He rings her cell and tells her to come by my place. She arrived at my apartment and I instantly became fond of her. She was hilarious, very pretty, and a musician, just like me. She was around 30, so 10 years older than me. My friend Matt was 35. I've always had friends that are much older for some reason. We played songs together and laughed hysterically for hours. Matt decided to go home, leaving us two alone. We chilled for a while longer, ended up making out, and I got all of her contact info before she told me she's going home and that we would meet up soon. Over the next few weeks, we'd develop a strong relationship and we hang out almost daily. I would throw some pajamas on and walk across the street and we'd get wasted and watch movies. It was awesome. After arriving home from my 10-day trip in New York City, things got really weird. The day I returned, she asked me if she could come over, so I unpacked my shit and then told her to stop by. She rings the buzzer, takes the elevator 7 floors up to my apartment, and lets herself in. I was talking non-stop about all of the awesome things I did and people I met in New York City, and I could immediately tell she didn't want to hear any of it. She would change the subject every time I brought it up, and eventually she said, "Can you stop talking about New York? I really don't give a fuck." I was surprised to hear her speak like this. The Emily I had been getting to know was not like this. She was caring and passionate, and an amazing person. So I thought. Fast forward to a few nights later. I had just gotten home from working a 12-hour shift and I collapse in my bed, ready to pass out for the night. It's about 9 p.m. and I get a text from Emily that says, "Hey, what's up?" I don't feel much like replying at the moment. I am too exhausted and our last hangout was too weird for me to comprehend, so I am still trying to decide how to deal with that. I plug my phone into charge, turn the lights off, and fall asleep effortlessly. I wake up to someone pounding on my door and screaming at the top of their lungs, "Open the fucking door! Let me in now!" My entire apartment reeks like cigarette smoke. I grab my phone from beside my bed, my heart beating a million miles per hour. 27 missed phone calls, and a bunch of text messages, all from Emily. I scan through the texts while she's still at the door screaming, trying to break my door down. The most recent text from her is a long one complaining I'm a piece of shit for not responding to her earlier, and that she's coming over to beat the shit out of me for not doing so. She had a key to the building still from when she used to live here. I get out of bed, nearly having a panic attack, and trying to decide what my next move should be. Should I open the door and calm her? Should I call the police? Should I just ignore her? I decided to open the door. She begins wailing on me, swinging her arms trying to hit me. She was smoking a cigarette, and there were 3 cigarette butts on the ground next to her. Smoking indoors is prohibited in my apartment building. She was very obviously on some sort of drug. She kept screaming at me, telling me how awful I am for not responding to her text message, slurring her speech and losing her balance. I was somehow able to calm her down, and I took her to the roof of the apartment building, which had a pretty nice little enclosed picnic table area. We sat beside one another. She was quiet now. Finally. She kept asking me how I could be such an asshole and that I needed to explain myself. The look in her eyes was pure evil as she spoke to me in a calm demeanor now. I said to her, "Emily, I don't ever want to speak to you again after tonight. This whole scenario is absolutely insane. You need help. Let me walk you home." I take her home and return to my apartment to attempt sleeping, at which I do not succeed. A couple of days later, I return home from work and there's an envelope taped to my door. I open it and it's a handwritten letter from Emily apologizing and saying that I'm a beautiful human who doesn't deserve an evil person like her in my life. There was a literal candy bar attached to the envelope, one that I had never heard of that she had always told me I needed to try. I never spoke to her again. From what Matt tells me, which by the way he always knew she was a problematic person, she is a heavy user of crack now and is working as a food runner in a restaurant nearby. I worked at a local government agency for a long time. Each summer we would get a new crop of interns. Most were fine. Some caused issues like the two we caught making out in the file room. Overall, they were just normal kids from high school or college trying to get some work experience. In 2016, my department received an intern later than usual, right in the middle of summer. Warner was a bit older than the usual crowd, around my age, maybe late 20s. We initially hit it off pretty well, and although I found him sort of strange, I didn't mind since he was friendly and we had some common interests. He was the only person in my department who was even close to my age. The interns were all teenagers, and the regular staff averaged around 60, older than my mom. I was psyched to have a peer to chat with, so occasionally I would eat lunch with Warner or stop to talk at his cubicle. His strangeness was mostly an outsized personality, a mix of over-the-top enthusiasm with a bit of social awkwardness. I got zero bad vibes from the guy. It wasn't long after Warner started having major performance problems at work. He would produce little to no work on most days, no show or late arrive without informing anyone, and generally acted unprofessionally. One day he showed up for work at 3:15 p.m., when our workday ended at 4:30. The office manager was livid and told him to go home. His behavior bothered everyone in my office, but I did not supervise him, and we had plenty of slacker interns in the past. While his antics were a bit of a spectacle, it wasn't a big deal to me. If you're wondering why he wasn't let go, 2 words: political favor. I found out from Warner himself that he was hired because his uncle donated to the campaign of our big boss. He wasn't going anywhere. Near the end of that summer, I put in my notice as I was leaving my job and relocating to a new state. Once Warner caught wind of this, he would constantly complain that it sucked I was leaving because we barely had time to become friends. I would always laugh lightly in response and give a sympathetic, "Yeah." He would start to monopolize my time at work more and more, and it became disruptive to the people who sat near me. I found it slightly annoying, but I was also extremely happy to be leaving that job for reasons unrelated to Warner, and I spent my last months there not caring much about what my coworkers thought. I tolerated him lingering by my desk. One day he caught me leaving work and offered me a ride home. I usually took the bus, and occasionally other coworkers would offer me rides home if they were going my way, so this didn't seem odd to me. I accepted and walked to his car with him. It smelled awful and was full of garbage. He hastily cleared off the passenger seat and apologized. We got on our way, but once we were on the main road, he started begging me to stop and get dinner with him. I laughed and said he didn't need to ask me that insistently, and said we could stop at a diner on the way. We had a nice meal with pleasant conversation. He was intelligent and had a variety of interests. Our political positions aligned and we shared disdain for our cranky old coworkers. I had a good time. I expressed that he didn't need to drive me all the way home now that it was late, but he kept insisting, so I relented. As I directed him towards my house, he started in again with the whining about how our developing friendship was cut short because I was moving. At this point, I was tired of hearing this. The decision to leave my job and move away from home was extremely difficult to make, and I was proud of how bold I was being. I stopped responding or laughing, and his whining faded out. We came up to the turn to get onto my street, and when I pointed it out, he accelerated and drove past it, laughing. I laughed in a, "Oh my god, what the fuck" way, thinking he was joking around. When I began giving instructions on how to turn around and get back, he started begging me to keep hanging out with him because he was lonely. This immediately set me on high alert. It suddenly hit me that I'm in a man's car, someone I don't know that well, who doesn't exercise proper behavior at work, which is the only context I know him. And now he's displaying weird behavior outside of work as well. My instinct was to not insist that I be let out of the car. I felt as if this would escalate the situation into something bad, and in hindsight it might have been the right thing to do when I think about the type of person he turned out to be. I told him we could hang out at the park near my house if he wanted to talk. He seemed to like that idea, and we parked and walked over. The pleasant conversations resumed. Besides the weird clinginess, He was perfectly fine to talk to. Until he dumped his entire life story on me, including his prior arrest for theft, his heroin addiction, and related struggles with depression. I tried to be sympathetic, but I was very put off by this. It was a lot of highly personal information all at once, and I was still on alert because of his prior behavior. I tried changing the subject by showing him pictures of my dog. I scrolled one pic too far and the next one was a photo of me wearing makeup and posing cutely. Way different than the slob I was at work. He grabbed the phone and went, "Wow, you are very photogenic." I felt awkward and didn't say anything. There was a long silence. Then he launched into a weird tangent about how compatible we are, and that we have similar interests, etc., and that he wishes I wasn't moving so we could try to hang out again. But on a date. I didn't say anything, and he broke the silence with, "Sorry I'm saying all this stuff. I'm actually high right now. That's why I know where Riverside is," a bad neighborhood that had previously come up in a conversation. "I was there yesterday, to buy. Otherwise I wouldn't have said it. I'm really sorry." Internally, I freaked out. He had definitely put his drug addiction in the past tense, and I assumed it was something he was recovering from, not currently using. I also realized that I had been in the car he was operating while under the influence. I don't know anything about heroin, so I was clueless. I felt very, very stupid. He immediately started whining and begging me not to judge him or hate him, and kept saying over and over again how nice I am and how understanding I am, that I'm pretty and smart. All of these weird comments interspersed with him talking about himself. I didn't know what to do, so I smiled reassuringly and told him not to worry, but I was tired and wanted to go home. That's when he started crying. He had this weird wheezy sob, but no tears were coming out. I sat there silently while he did this, trying to come up with some sort of graceful escape plan. My patience was wearing thin and my anxiety was through the roof. It's a weird feeling to be annoyed and panicky at the same time. I stood up and apologized, said the park was close to my house so I'll walk, and started to leave. When I remembered, I left my stuff in his car. Trying a new approach, I casually mentioned I forgot my stuff in his car, and joked that if he wanted my dirty lunch containers, he could keep them. He ceased his bizarre crying, stood up and ran over to his car to unlock it, and I grabbed my stuff out of his back seat. His demeanor changed drastically, and he calmly apologized for making things weird, and asked if he could drop me off at home so I didn't have to walk alone at night. I said yes, but made him drop me off a block over from my little side street so he couldn't see which house was mine. I could end it there, but what bothered me the most about this guy happened after the encounter. I'll make this part short. A week or two after the weird evening, end of August by this point, I had my last day at the job and moved 1,000 miles away across the country. Warner would sometimes text me long ramblings detailing his feelings about himself and about our missed opportunity. I didn't respond to these messages. Now that I wasn't near him, I didn't feel I needed to placate. The text stopped after a few weeks, and I forgot about him. Fast forward to February, and I get a text from my coworker. Her message said, "Sorry you had to hear about it this way." And her text message went to link a local news article titled, "Man dies from wounds in Riverside stabbing, Wednesday." Because of the way she worded it, I thought Warner was the victim. But when I read the article, it included his mugshot in the charges. He was the attacker. He murdered someone. I felt so shocked and disgusted. I couldn't believe I knew someone who killed another human. Later on, I called an old work friend for some details. Apparently, shortly after I left the job, he was fired for trashing the men's bathroom. Just threw around anything he could lift and poured all the soap out and smeared it all over the place. He then lost his apartment, presumably. Some of the articles about the stabbing describe Warner as a homeless man. I have to assume that's how he ended up in the aforementioned Riverside. There are a lot of homeless drug addicts who squat in the abandoned houses. I wondered if the man he stabbed had refused to give him something that he wanted, and that is how he reacted to a hard no. I don't think I made all of the wisest decisions during my interactions with Warner, but I'm glad that I was able to avoid setting him off, since he was clearly not stable. Hands down the worst intern I've ever encountered. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. And if you would like to help support the channel and get your own custom badge, I recommend checking out the membership button down by the subscribe button. I hope everyone is having a great day, and I will catch you in the next video. And just remember, it's always scary if it's true. Years ago, I worked in a fast food restaurant. I had a manager there named John. John seemed like a pretty cool guy. We would hang out after work and smoke a couple bowls together, but that was about the extent of our friendship. Until I received a call one night. John was letting me know that he had gotten in a fight with his significant other and needed some help. He said he was drunk and his stuff was on the side of the road, not far from my apartment. I told him I'd be right there to help and to just wait. I go outside and walk down the street. In the distance, I see John. He's clearly drunk. He's got his bike that he's trying to hold up and his pants are around his ankles. And then I see what he had dropped in the road. He dropped about 2 pounds of shake. As soon as I pull up, John's trying to pick up this weed off the street, at about 10 p.m. I tell him to just leave it or he's going to get in trouble. I take off my belt, put it around him so his pants stay up, and I grab his bicycle and push it towards my place. My girlfriend's there and we decide to let him sleep out his drunkenness. Big mistake. He wakes up about an hour after he passed out, and cracks a beer open that he brought with him with his stuff, chugs the beer, and then goes back to sleep. My girlfriend and I look at each other perplexed. Another hour goes by, and he wakes up and stumbles into my bathroom. The door closes and we start hearing crashing everywhere. He stumbles back out, cracks open another beer, and then lays back down. I go into the bathroom and it's pretty much destroyed. The towel holder's bent and off the wall. The toilet seat's mangled. I go back out to my girlfriend and roll my eyes. An hour later, he wakes up again and chugs a beer. Then pukes all over our coffee table. And then goes back to sleep. My girlfriend and I at this point are having a blast. This was exactly how we wanted our night to be. We clean up his vomit and I hunt down the rest of his beers that he has stowed away in a trash bag and put them outside. The next day I'm laying in bed, having not slept at all but not wanting to go to sleep with a drunk guy in my house, and my girlfriend sitting on the couch. Out of nowhere, John says, "I have a big dick." Silence. That's when I pipe up and say, "Yeah, John, you kinda ruined it." Silence again. We eventually get him out of our house and then we find out from his significant other that he's a binge drinker, as well as he's HIV positive. The real kicker is, as I stated, he worked in a fast food restaurant. He prepared people's food, with cuts on his hands because it turns out he was a tweaker as well. And he wore no gloves. No gloves, making people's food that they were about to consume. How's that for a scary story? And once again, that story is not made up. That's a story that happened to me in my life. Yes, and my wife now. She was the girlfriend in that story. Oh, John, oh, John, oh, John. And then the funny thing is when I was getting ready to move, he's like, "Hey, we should hang out." And I was like, "Nah, I'm good, bro, I'm good." And that's not the first or the last time my friend, well, kind of friend, is like puked on me. I had another buddy, he puked on me, but he wasn't even drunk. He said he was sick and he wanted some water. So I got him that, and then I got him the water, and then he said he needed to puke. So I brought him to the bathroom, was lifting up the toilet seat, blah, puke all over my side. He's super embarrassed about that. He still apologizes to this day. Maybe in the next video I'll do the story about the neighbors that stabbed each other at that same apartment complex. Very interesting. Hope everyone enjoyed this story. I don't think it's really that funny. It might be funny for some of you. Sucked for me going through it, but yeah, that's what you get for helping people sometimes. Yeah. Watch out for those crazies out there. They're everywhere. Catch y'all in the next video. Have a good one. There's hand.
and placed his feet with my hand in a specific location on the rock ledge, where I remembered jumping from the last time I was there months before. I explained to him that I knew he was scared, and so was I, but we needed to jump out as far as we could, and slightly to the right, otherwise we would hit the rocks. He was shaking, crying, and kept telling me that he couldn't do it. He then urinated on himself. The men laughed and kept saying they couldn't believe how big of pussies we were. I then told my brother that we needed to jump now, and that we would be okay if he listened to me. I told him that after we jumped, we could swim to the shore on the right, and would hide in the bushes until. The following story takes place back in April of 2010. At the time, I was working as an overnight security guard for a dairy manufacturing facility located in Boyle Heights, California. Having worked there for just about over a year, I had grown accustomed to my job and its surrounding environment. Or so I thought. The facility was part of a decent-sized industrial area. Directly across from this facility sat a housing development surrounded by a small neighborhood. Although the housing development was called Ramona Gardens, it was commonly referred to as the Hazard Projects. This urban nickname was attributed to the local street gang. My means of getting to work involved either public transportation or lengthy recreational walking. Whichever I chose, my trip would always culminate in a shortcut through the back of the Hazard Projects. My mother, who was greatly familiar with this area, would constantly express her concern over me working there. After all, the area was known for its fair share of gang activity. She would even go as far as evaluating my route to work. Once she caught wind of my shortcut, she wasn't exactly thrilled. I'm not suggesting that she has little faith in her 21-year-old son. She was just being a mother. Let me take this opportunity to apologize for any lack of detail when it comes to describing the following incident. Given the circumstances of the situation, I hope you can understand. It was a Friday evening, and I was relatively early to work. I was less than a block away from the shortcut with a little over an hour left to spare. Before stepping into the much-traveled path, I hesitated. I'm not a habitual smoker, yet here I was, with the odd craving for a pack of cigarettes. The nearest liquor store was just about a block away, and had I given in to my unusual temptation, I would have avoided the shortcut. Emphasis on the word avoided. I stepped onto the path, preoccupied with my cell phone. I was in the middle of a texting conversation with a friend of mine. Suddenly, my path was cut off by a teenage boy riding a scooter. He was no older than 16, Hispanic, roughly 5'3", shaved head, wearing all black baggy clothing. He stared me down intently before asking in an aggressive tone, "Where the fuck you stay at, dog?" For those of you who are not familiar with this situation, it usually means bad news. I ignored his question and tried to walk around him. Once again, he cut off my path and repeated the question. "I'm not from around here. I'm just trying to get to work," I responded in an unaggressive manner. Once again, he stared me down intently. He shot me a look of a malicious intent as he responded with, "Give us your shit." That's when I realized that he wasn't alone. His 4 friends, all presumably the same age, revealed themselves at the appropriate time. I acknowledged their presence with a heavy sigh. I responded firmly with, "I'm not giving you my shit, man." One of the other 4 boys drew closer to the scene. "He ain't gonna give up his shit. Let's fucking take it then," he proclaimed. The odds were obviously not in my favor, but that as it may, I knew I had no choice but to stand my ground. There was an awkward moment of silence before someone had decided to make a move. Unfortunately, that someone wasn't me. The boy who had confronted me in the first place took notice of my cell phone being held in my left hand. He smacked it out of my hand. As it fell to the ground, I stupidly allowed my head to follow its path. Suddenly, my face was met with a right hook. I was circled by 5 boys as each of them began to strike me on multiple spots of my body. "He's going down!" one of them yelled in desperation. In my moment of misplaced awareness, my adrenaline began to run its course. I knew if I was somehow able to prevent them from taking me to the ground, maybe I could have a chance. I began to swing wildly until I hit something. I struck one of the boys on his chin, As he staggered backwards, I grabbed him by his collar and began to repeatedly strike his face without mercy. Why I focused all my aggression on only one of them, I have no clue. Suddenly, I felt a great blow to the back of my head. The impact was sufficient enough to knock me off my feet. They had taken me to the ground. I could barely feel their strikes as they began to viciously stomp on my body. Before blacking out, I remember feeling one of the boys reach into my pants pockets. They made off with my cell phone and wallet. The wallet must have been an incredible steal. After all, it did have $300 in it. When I had regained consciousness moments later, I wasn't able to immediately react to the situation. Once I had become fully aware, I decided to assess the damage inflicted on my body while taking in my surrounding area. I wasn't alone. I was cautiously approached by a much older gentleman. Thankfully, his presence was of good intent. He carefully helped me to my feet. He shot me a look of pity as I told him the situation. As I began to regain my composure, I had made the sudden realization that my wallet had been stolen. The old man was caught off guard as I began to scream out violent threats intended for my aggressors. He tried to calm me down and suggested that I should just walk away. At first, I protested. He grabbed me by the shoulder and said in a firm tone, "I know you're angry, but you can't be stupid. You told me your job was around the corner. I suggest you go there and get help. Just walk away." I took his advice with a grain of salt. Before going our separate ways, I expressed my deepest gratitude. Before I could even collect my thoughts, I was met with an outrageous, "Fuck you!" The same 5 boys who had attacked me earlier had returned for an encore performance. They wanted my backpack, something both parties had overlooked earlier. Not even 2 minutes earlier, I was ready to fight to retain what was rightfully mine. Let's just say, reality hit me like a ton of bricks. As the 5 boys approached me demanding my backpack, I had realized that I was in no condition to put up a fight. Naturally, I was knocked to the ground. Before taking the backpack, they once again stomped on my body viciously. Getting back on my feet proved to be much more difficult this time around. It didn't help that my sense of equilibrium was completely worth shit. Nevertheless, I had somehow managed to make it to work. In order to gain access to the facility, my coworker would have to unlock the staff entrance gate. Luckily, he had just returned from a perimeter patrol. As he spotted me crossing the street, he approached the gate with a childish smile on his face. Mind you, the streets were dimly lit. When he had noticed my disoriented walking, he assumed I was messing around. Once I stepped into the light, his smile quickly faded. He fiddled with the lock as he began to frantically ask, "What the fuck happened?" Within 10 minutes, a black and white approached our property. The LAPD had been contacted by my supervisor once he was notified of the incident. I was met by 2 young officers. One took my statement, while the other took a look at my injuries. He strongly suggested that I seek medical attention. For some reason, I tried to reject it. The officer looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Listen, you're in pretty bad shape. You've suffered major head trauma and a broken nose. How you managed to walk here in your current condition is a fucking miracle." I was then transported to White Memorial Hospital. The next thing I remember was waiting patiently in urgent care. The officers who attended to me earlier were present at the hospital. They were having a lengthy discussion with my examiner just as my mother arrived. She was accompanied by my uncle, aunt, and cousins. The examiner took time to discuss the injuries with my mother and me. He indicated that I had received a blunt force trauma to the back of my head. Thankfully, there was no immediate signs of potential brain damage. The swelling on my face would most likely go down within a couple of days. That following week, I was set up to visit an ENT specialist regarding my broken nose. On top of that, they were also going to perform an additional CAT scan for safe measure. A few days after the incident, I had met with my employer at their regional office. Their first course of action was to transfer me to another work site. My manager had arranged for me to receive a check for compensation. Since then, I have not once returned to that part of the neighborhood. My attackers were never caught, and the identity of the Good Samaritan remains a mystery to this day. I am a 17-year-old male, living in the Midwest United States. Last year during my senior year, I decided to join the track team in the spring. I wanted to increase my stamina, so I joined the long distance team. Being on the long distance team, I would have to run a couple of miles every practice. Near our high school was a small forest with biking trails that led to a little lake that our track team would run to. As I said before, I was trying to increase my stamina, so I was always farther behind the other runners. The little forest was dense with a lot of wildlife, mostly common deer. To give a quick layout of the trail, imagine a forest that slopes, with a dirt bike trail carved into the side of the slope. As usual, I fell pretty far behind the others. I was exhausted, and I had to stop to rest as I was breathing heavily. As I was taking a break, I heard some twigs snap from behind me. When I turned around, I expected to see a deer, but instead I saw a man at the top of the slope. This man was pretty tall, around 6 feet. He was wearing bleached jeans and a dark red shirt. I thought it was pretty weird that a random guy would be off trail and at the top of a slope in pretty dense trees. I felt as if all time stopped while we just stared at each other. Suddenly, my fight or flight kicked in, and I bolted down the trail. I turned around as I was running, and this guy was running down the slope at an angle. He was doing this to cut me off at the trail. The weirdest part was that this man was using the trees to propel himself down the slope. At this point, I was beginning to tire to the point I could no longer run. I decided that now that I couldn't run, I was going to have to fight this dude. I've been training in martial arts since I was 3, and at the time, I was a 2nd degree black belt in Taekwondo. Keeping in mind that I was tired, I ripped off a stick from a broken branch and was ready to bash this prick's head in. The man got down the slope, blocking my path. He had an unkempt beard, his hair was greasy and tangled, and even from the distance he was standing, I could smell his terrible body odor. He smiled with yellow and brown teeth, eyes wide, and began to slowly walk towards me. I raised the stick and warned him, "Fuck off!" I will never forget the words that came out of his mouth next. He simply said, "Oh, that's too bad. All I want to do is play." With a yell, I closed the rest of the distance and I brought the stick down as hard as I could. The man moaned and fell back, giving me time to run past him. I ran as fast as I could, crying and in shock. As I neared the end of the woods, my coach was waiting for me. I decided not to tell her what had happened until we got back. I'm not sure what my school did, but for the rest of the track season, we didn't run in those woods again. This might not be your typical encounter, but it chilled me to the core. It's actually the main reason I no longer work in the industry, though I tell people it was the hours that made me quit. This happened when I was doing nightclub security in the UK. I was just chilling on the front door. I see a fight happening with a guy chasing another down the street, and I'm like, oh well, it happens. 99% of the time they would just shout a little bit and try to intimidate one another, and then go get a kebab and puke. Mainly, they just look to make the other person think they're going to fight. Think peacocks shaking feathers at one another. This time, however, the guys got into a tussle against a parked car, and pretty quickly the chased guy was down for the count, and passed out after some heavy blows. At this point, I need to intervene. It has literally been seconds since the start of the fight, but they are across the very busy one-way street, so I decide to try and stop cars so I can get over there on time. Feels like hours, but I get in between them. The aggressor guy is kicking the other guy's head over and over, full force as he lies on the ground. I realize he might die. I don't know why I was getting in the middle, but I couldn't help it. I get between them, shout at the aggressor to stop. Luckily, guys don't often like to fight girls. I am ready to defend myself in any case. He makes at me like he's going to start kicking me too, and I brace myself to block any strikes. He grins and books it up the road instead, and I can focus on the guy on the ground. I try to give him first aid and stop the bleeding, but his face is just a hole basically, so it's pretty hard, and the back of his head is gone too. I know of the old, if you need someone in a gathering to phone an ambulance, you need to choose a person and give them direct orders, not just ask in general. So I ask, more like I bark an order at, the only guy I see around with a phone out to call 999. His eyes are blank, and he holds his phone still. It's like in a nightmare when you yell to draw attention to something, but no one can hear you. I tell him again. Nothing. I start shouting, raising my voice. He needs to call an ambulance. This guy is dying. He needs help. I realize, by the way the guy is moving around, that he is filming us, probably trying to get a good shot of the guy's face as he lies dying by me. I feel like I am a black mirror. Eventually, someone else phoned, and I haven't seen any YouTube clips from that area or rough date, though I have looked. He might have taken it down. My insistent shouting at him and asking him what is wrong with him might have deprived him of some likes or something. I don't know what happened to any party. I'm going to court soon for the assault/attempted murder, but I'm not sure what the charge is. I'm pretty sure the injured guy made it out. I never saw anything about it in the news, which is a good indicator. He might not have been so lucky though. I am sure he stopped breathing just before help arrived. I just pray that if something happens to me or someone I care about, bystanders will call for help instead of trying to capture suffering on film. I live in this small town 30 miles away from New Orleans, Louisiana. The town is one of those everybody knows everybody types of setups, so there were really no strangers. At the time I was 17 years old and left from my house to go play football with some guys from school. I would say I was 13 minutes away from my house by car. The friends I came with decided that they would walk up and down the street to wait for the rest of the guys to show up so that we could get started, and I basically did the same. After hours of waiting, we were pretty set on them not showing up, so we just kept talking just in case they did. Then some girls showed up from my school, and my friends wanted to talk to them. Since I had a girlfriend, I decided I would leave that to them and continue walking. If you live in Louisiana, then you know how much levees are used, so I decided to continue my walk on this levee holding back the Great Mississippi River. By this time it was maybe 7:30, but in Louisiana it's usually dark pretty early, so it was pitch black. I paced back and forth in the levee, waiting for my friends to finish up so that we could go home, when this group of guys caught my eye. There were 3 of them, and they walked towards me. When they got closer, I recognized them as some boys I knew from school. Like I said, it was a small town. We chatted for a little while, and eventually we went our separate ways. 20 minutes passed, and I still didn't get a text from my friends. What was taking them so long to get out of there and go home? I just accepted that I was probably going to be there a little while longer, and sat down on the levee. As time went by, I watched the cars pass on the highway, and most of them slowed down to get on the bridge to take them across the river, when I heard a loud thud. I looked around and noticed that the boys from my school were still down the levee a little further back. I studied them as I saw one of them throw something, and again I heard a loud thud. And then it hit me. They were throwing rocks at passing cars on the highway. That was pretty stupid to me, as they were basically flirting with trouble, and I decided to move a little further ahead of them and try to detach myself from them, if they were to get caught. Then I heard another thud, but this one was loud. I looked and saw they double-tagged this silver car and put a huge dent in this guy's door and nicked his window pretty good. I decided not to leave, because at that moment it would make me look guilty, as they were throwing all these rocks at passing cars. The silver car slowed down and turned to get on the bridge, or so I thought. It kinda made no sense, but the car went around the bridge and basically did a whole circle back to where the group of guys were. The car parked, and out emerged 3 big guys. I stayed seated in my position and started to watch what was unfolding. The guys hurried up the levee and started walking towards the group of boys from my school. "Hey," I heard one of the men say. "Hey," one of the boys answered back, and after that they took off running. Don't get me wrong, I thought about running too, but decided against it, telling myself that I didn't want to do anything that would make me look guilty. As the boys ran down the levee and into a field, the group of men approached me. I stand up to basically not have them tower over me, and then this guy goes in. "You fucking throwing rocks at my car?" "No, I've been sitting here the whole time," I answer. "What the fuck's in your pocket?" he asks, and I see he's talking about my basketball shorts I have stuffed in my sweats. I pull them out and show him that it's just shorts, and I thought it was clear. But I was wrong. We started going back and forth about me trying to declare my innocence when he did something that stopped me dry. He was reaching into his waistband, and the moon shined on something metal. Instantly I knew he had a gun, and that I wasn't in a good position. "You sure that wasn't you throwing the rocks?" he asks as he pulls the gun all the way out. I would be lying if I said I wasn't afraid. You always hear about kids getting murdered in New Orleans on the news, and I sure thought I was next. "No, it wasn't me," I exclaimed. "Why do you think I didn't run?" I look down and see his hand shaking, and then he starts to lift it towards me. At this point I thought I was a goner, but then the second guy out of the three told them that I was so lucky that I didn't run, because they were going to put a bullet in everyone's back that they saw leaving. I nodded slowly, and with that they got back in their car. Many people in that situation would have called the police or run away, or anything. But I did nothing. I went back to sit on the levee as I was before. The car hadn't moved yet, and even though the windows were tinted, I could tell they were watching me. I pretended to listen to music or something, and I guess that scared them away, and they continued down the road. That's when everything hit me, and I took off running across the highway, and I looked in the direction the car went, and I saw my worst nightmare. The car was returning. I never ran so fast in my life like I ran that day. The car must have been traveling pretty fast due to its quick return, and I knew I had to be unseen. The car came down the street, and I had only one option: get under a nearby house. I practically dove under the house and laid there until I heard footsteps. "I saw him run back here," the third guy said. Then the guy with the gun said something I'll never forget. "I don't give a fuck if you find him. Kill him." I remained still, but my body was going crazy. I was so scared I thought my heartbeat was going to give away my position. They searched around the house and field for a while, and got back in their car to drive away. I wasn't going anywhere. I didn't know exactly where they went, but I wasn't going out after what I heard them say. The car made a few more passes up and down the street, until I couldn't see them anymore. That's when I decided I was safe for now. I slid from under the house and peeked around. I couldn't see anything. It was so dark, but I didn't care about that. I just needed... "Where were you?" my friend asked. "We've been texting your phone like crazy." I just stared back at them, and basically threw myself in the back seat. After that, I told them everything. They pushed me so hard to go to the police, but I never saw those guys before in my life, and I wasn't really focused on their faces to make an ID. I was fighting for my life. That really shook me for a couple of weeks, but I soon got over it. It kinda shakes me thinking back on it. All I can say is make good decisions, because if I would have done anything different, I would have been dead. This happened last summer, and I still can't take my mind off the whole situation. It's by far the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. First things first, I am a female and I am 20 years old. I live in a small village in England. It's beautiful, and I've lived here my whole life, so I have many good memories here. In June, I started walking to the neighboring village every day, which took maybe around 25 minutes to walk to. The village is a lot more old-fashioned and has a lot of history. The journey was fun for me because I love the countryside. It's a beautiful place, and it interests me quite a lot too. As soon as you left my village, you would be walking on country lanes that led you to the other village. Usually, I would just leave my house at around 11 a.m. and start heading back to my own village roughly around 2 or 3 p.m. I went alone most of the time, apart from the weekends when I would go with close friends. Both my village and this village only consisted of houses, parks, and churches. You know, all that sort of stuff. When I went alone, I sat at a beautiful park and would sit on a picnic bench and read a book or sit on my phone for hours. I even bought a phone case that charges my phone just so my phone wouldn't run out of charge. I did this for a month, until mid-July when I went shopping and sat in a pub at the closest city with my friends on a Thursday. This meant that I didn't go to the village at the usual time. I got back quite late, maybe around 9 p.m. I don't know what was going through my mind, but I decided that I would go to the village tonight due to the fact that I wasn't tired and was in a good mood. I left my house at 9:30 and started heading there. It was getting quite dark, so when I left my village and entered the country lanes, I got my flashlight on my phone up. I was walking for about 5 through 10 minutes before I realized that what I was doing was stupid. Walking the country lanes at this time of night was not a good idea. Stupidly, I continued on. It was no longer than 2 minutes later that I noticed a silhouette in the distance. It was standing about 20 yards away next to a sign that told you which direction you could turn. I felt pretty awkward because I didn't want to pass this person at this time of night, especially on my own. I crossed the road to walk on the opposite side, and the person was just standing there, and they were staring at the ground. As I got closer, I could make out what they were wearing. It was a man wearing a black hoodie, tracksuit bottoms, and some muddy trainers. I got closer and closer, and when he finally knew I was there, he looked up and stared at me. For some reason, I stared back, but carried on walking. I kept walking straight for about 10 seconds, until I heard him walking behind me. I turned around, and he had crossed the road to my side. I then noticed his face. I was terrified and disgusted. He looked like he had been on drugs for most of his life, and must have been in his mid-30s. I couldn't turn around now. I was halfway there and knew for a fact that he would follow me if I did. I didn't know what to do. I still had at least 10 minutes of walking left, and was in the middle of nowhere. No people were around, and the closest building was in the village. I had no friends in the area either, so I couldn't go to anybody's house. I started walking faster, but so did he. I was petrified at this point. Things like this don't happen to people like me. Or that's what I thought. I started to cry a little, and then I heard him say in the most horrifying and evil tone I've ever heard, "You can't escape me, young lady." I started running and screaming. I don't know how to explain it, but I couldn't control my screaming. It was like I was automatically doing it, if that makes sense. He started running too, and he was much faster than me. Could this whole scenario get any worse? I thought to myself. I slowed down, extremely out of breath. I cursed my asthma for this. Tears were streaming down my face, and I felt like I was going to collapse. Then this creep grabs me, and I fall to the ground screaming louder than I've ever screamed before. I don't know how I could possibly have screamed like this, considering I was out of breath and having a panic attack. He was lying on top of me. He was so heavy and smelt so bad that I could have thrown up. I couldn't see his face anymore due to the tears in my eyes. I paused for a second. Then he whispered in my ear, "I won't hurt you, but I will break your neck if you continue to scream like that." Regardless of what he just said, I continued for what felt like an eternity. I heard a car heading towards us in the distance. I screamed, "Help me!" I felt a lot of relief when I heard the car slowing down. "Help me, please!" I continued. The guy got off me and sprinted into a cornfield. A man and a woman stepped out of the car. They must have been not that much older than me, and they asked me what happened. I told them the whole situation, stuttering and gasping for air. The woman sat with me and gave me some water, and luckily she had an inhaler. The man shouted for the creep, who we could all still see sprinting extremely fast down the field, then took off after him. They both took me home, and I thank them both ever so much for helping me. God knows what would have happened if they didn't stop, or even notice me. I told my friends about the whole event, and a lot of people met me during the weekend and comforted me. The police were notified, but unfortunately, the creep was never caught. I didn't have a good enough description of his face, and of course there was no CCTV footage in that area. Of course, I never walk the streets, especially country lanes after dark anymore. I only visit the village every week now since this event, and only ever go with my close friend Courtney. My lesson here is that no matter how safe your area may sound, there will always be bad people around, and you should never walk the streets at this time alone. The night I'm going to talk about was nearly the last night of my life, and I gained a strong belief in fate after it. It's early August 2014. I'm 17 years old and working a late shift at McDonald's, one of my first part-time jobs. It's a Saturday, and my best friend, with whom I just started to go out drinking, is disappointed because I'm at work. The shift is unusually quiet. At 7 p.m. the manager declares that one of the newbies, myself and another guy, can go home. It comes down to a coin toss, which I win. I know this sounds dumb, but that coin toss nearly cost me my life. I immediately hop on a bus home, shower, change, and set off to meet my friend. We go to a student union bar on the outside of Manchester. In 2004, we were still enjoying the golden age of extremely lax ID procedures and easily got into this bar on fake ID cards from the internet. We got a little too drunk. I was so irresponsible at 17. We'd mix shots of whiskey, vodka, etc., all into a glass, then down it. While screwing around on the dance floor, I knocked a guy's drink out of his hand. He started to blow up, and I promptly walked away. His friends kicked me in the back as I did so. I later learned that he had been kicked out after throwing a bottle at my head, which missed me, so I had no idea that it had even happened. We left the club, which led out into a passage beside the college it was attached to. This passage fed through onto the busiest road running through our town, but it was about 2 a.m. and dead quiet. By this point, my buddy had bumped into some old friends from our high school and didn't notice me break away from the group. There was a petrol station directly opposite, where we would always get sandwiches for the munchies. At this point, my memory is a blur of what could be memories or bits of eyewitnesses' accounts that I've constructed into false memories. I'll tell it as if I were seeing it for the purpose of clarity. I was drunk off my face. I walked/jogged towards the garage. A car came from the car park adjoining the passage. It was long, the path, so it easily cleared the park and got out onto the road before I got there. As I stepped out into the road, this car had, unknown to me, accelerated to 30 miles per hour and struck my right leg as I placed it forward on the ground. This is incredibly important to the story and my survival. First, about the car. Oh God, how I was lucky that I was dealing with the chump from the club. He had a typical, look-at-me modified car with a low bumper. It was nearly touching the pavement. This resulted in my foot being scooped up. A regular bumper would likely have buckled and shattered my ankle at this angle, so I'm told. So, it hits my right leg. I'm in the middle of stride and this saves my life. The car instantly snaps both bones in my lower leg, but crucially, it spins me like a coin around on the side, not over the bonnet and roof. I break 2 ribs on my right side as I hit the bonnet, and puncture a lung too. My right forearm impacts the passenger side window as I'm flipped around the car, UK car layout, and the glass destroys my arm. I later see in the hospital that it was akin to taking an ice cream scoop down to the bone. I bounced off the car and onto the road at this point. My landing couldn't have been more unlucky. I land on the shattered fragments of window and essentially roll across a lake of glass, shredding my arms. I don't honestly know if I remember this. Writing this story, I get fragments of super realistic memories, but it's like my mind is saying, hell no, and recalling them before I can properly picture them, and it makes me feel sick. I guess that's regression for you. My best friend at the time called my parents and an ambulance. I spent 14 days in the hospital, had emergency surgery repair on my leg, cosmetic surgery on my arm, and my leg now contains a titanium bar that's great fun at airports. But apart from the late day tingling, I walk and run normally, I had a fantastic surgeon fix my arm without the need for skin grafts too. The whole bunch of people outside the club later gave statements that Mr. Bottle Thrower had accelerated and swerved intentionally into my path. His girlfriend was riding up front and was covered in my blood. What a lovely bloke. He went to jail, but I don't know for how long. I moved to the south of England several years later. I live in a cabin on about 50 acres of fields and woods with my mom. We'd been enjoying a day of sitting on our asses and watching television. However, I had to mow my grandmother's yard this afternoon. I told my mom that I had a yard to mow today, and it went as follows. "It's cooler outside. I guess it's a good time to get off my ass," I said. "Or you could just call and tell her you'll do that tomorrow," replied my mom. "Nah, I'll just get my things together and go," and proceed to grab my headphones, e-cigarette, etc. I headed down the driveway, topped the hill, and lo and behold, there was at least 20 highway patrol cars in the middle of my field and about 70 feet from my truck. I just assumed that our neighbor, who had a history of cutting up, had just gotten himself in trouble with the law over drugs or something. When I pulled out of the gate, I told the local cops that I'm the landowner and asked if everything was alright. He said, "It's going to be," whatever that means. On the way to my grandmother's house, I called my mom and I said, "I don't know any way to put this other than, there are like 100 cops in our field." She said that she's on the way to check it out. I called her a few times, with no answer, so I assumed that she was talking to the cops or something. I knew she'd be safe with all of the cops, so I went ahead and started mowing the grass. Plus, my grandmother is only a couple of miles down the road. When I was about halfway done mowing, she called me and said that the troopers had nothing to say, but one of the local cops that she knew said that it was a guy who was wanted in Texas for shooting 3 people, killing 2 and injuring 1. The guy drove into our field and shot himself after being confronted/surrounded by troopers. When I was done mowing, I headed home to pick her up, and we drove back to talk to the last of the few troopers. I told them that I'm the property owner, and asked if it was all clear, and if everything was safe now. They said they had just moved the body and car out, so it's clear. I said, "Wow, all the way from Texas, huh? Well, be safe. Thanks." We drove over to the site after the troopers left. Right behind our old pecan tree was a bunch of tire treads and a giant bloody spot in the grass. We're still in a state of, what the fuck? Going by the press conference we just watched as I typed this guy shot himself as I was going up the driveway. I didn't even hear the gunshot or sirens, but I remember having my radio turned up. In the description you can find a link to a couple of the news articles pertaining to the story. This is a story about the most disturbing thing that has ever happened to me while delivering pizzas in high school. There are a few others, but this one stands out above the rest. I was 16 years old and just got my license, so I needed a job to pay for a car. A few of my good friends were working at a local pizza place in a town close to my house, so I decided to apply, and got the job without an interview because they were so short-staffed. They also hired me as a delivery driver without ever checking to see if I had a driver's license. I did, but I always thought that was funny. About a month or 2 later, we were having a really busy night, and I was sent off to a delivery in a fairly nice part of town in the next city over. This was before GPS was common, and not very reliable, so we still used maps to locate houses. This particular house was in a new development, so it wasn't listed in any of our directories, but my boss thought he knew where it was and gave me directions. He was way off, so I had to call the house for directions, and this is where things got weird. The conversation on the phone was normal. I told the man I was near his house, but needed directions because the ones I was given weren't accurate. He was very understanding and told me how to get there from the road I was on. A few minutes later, I pull into his driveway, and instantly get a bad feeling. He was a man in his early 50s or 60s and was standing in the middle of his driveway with a creepy, satisfied smile on his face and wearing a maroon silk bathrobe. I got out of my car and gave him his 10-inch Hawaiian pizza, which costed $10.95 at the time. He gave me a $20 bill and told me to keep the change. Considering I was on a late-night delivery and had to call the customer for directions, I wasn't expecting anything for a tip, let alone almost $10. I drove away from the delivery, thinking that something was off, but I got a great tip, so I was happy. I lit up a smoke and turned on my radio when I felt my phone vibrate. It was the number from the house I was just at. I got nervous thinking it was going to be a complaint or something, because why else would someone call the delivery guy after he delivered your food? My blood curdled at the words that came out of his mouth. "Do you want to come back over and get the knife?" he said. Or at least that's what I heard. I said nothing and hung up the phone and drove back to work as fast as I could. I also called one of my friends who was working there at the time and told him what happened. On the 5-minute ride back to work, he called me at least 3 or 4 times. For some reason, I actually answered one of the calls, and he asked me if I wanted to come back after I get off work and spend the night. I was greeted at work by laughter from pretty much everyone working that night. Everyone thought I was either faking or overreacting. Then I got another call on my phone from the same guy. I showed my manager while the phone was ringing and let it go to voicemail. That's when he decided to call the restaurant. Once this happened, my manager realized that this was probably a serious situation and answered the phone pretending to be me. He had a very short conversation with the guy, and at the end he told him he is not allowed to do business with us anymore and we are blocking his number. When my boss hung up the phone, his face was pure white and looked like he could barely comprehend what had just happened. I asked him what the guy said, but my boss would not repeat the words that came out of his mouth. I was so paranoid that I had to stay with a friend that night instead of going home. Guess who called me a couple hours later? Yeah, he called. At least 10 times. For at least a week or 2, I was living in fear of being kidnapped. I was always looking at the people or cars that were around me, being paranoid that I was being watched or followed. It's possible that I was right, because I started getting phone calls again. This is when I decided it was time to call the cops and put an end to this. I explained everything to the officer, and he assured me that he would take care of the situation. Turns out, the cop did nothing. I live in a low-crime town with less than 20,000 people. This guy didn't have anything else to do that day except write some speeding tickets during the afternoon, then some DWIs in the evening. The calls kept coming, and my paranoia grew. This needed to stop, so I told my boss that things hadn't improved, and he called the cops himself. An officer came down to the restaurant and took down our statements. Unlike the other officer, this man seemed visibly shaken and angered by the events that had happened. He promised me that he would personally handle the situation and that I didn't have to worry anymore. This police officer followed up on what he said, and I never heard from the creep again. I kept that same job for 3 years and had nothing but great times there. This happened to me about 2 years ago. It was the last day of school, and I was really looking forward to summer vacation. My cousin, Tana, invited me over to stay the night. Being the bored, anxious kid I was, I said yes and that I would be there in an hour. Finally, it was time to go to Tana's, and I was excited. As usual, my dad left me with a kiss on the head and, no foolishness. I responded with my usual giggle and, "Don't worry, Dad." I walked up the stairs to the front porch, and I was greeted by my cousin, giving me a big bear hug. This wasn't the first time that she had nearly knocked me down with a hug. We never really see each other that much. I reply with a simple, "Hey," followed by a wave. As we walk into the house, I see my aunt and uncle, and I give them both hugs. We head to Tana's room and play Xbox, watch a few movies, and eat some junk. It was around 10:30 p.m. when we decided we wanted to try some prank calls, and as we were getting ready for our first victim, we heard what sounded like the outer front door swing open and hit the side of the house. Keep in mind that this is definitely not unusual, but it still scared the shit out of us. I gripped onto Tana's arm and said, "Why does it do that?" in a shaky voice. She said that it's just from the wind. So, not thinking too much of it, we just went back to watching TV. 11:25 p.m. rolled around, and we heard footsteps stomping on the stairs. That's when Tana and I lost our shit and ran to her brother's room, got all the bats that we could find, and ran back to Tana's room. She finally worked up the guts to look through the blinds. When she did, she turned to me with sheer terror in her eyes and whimpered, "He's out there." I looked at her like she was crazy and asked, "Tana, what the fuck? This isn't funny. Who's out there?" Then, all of a sudden, Tana broke into a sob and said, "You think I'm lying? I know what I saw." I was so dumbstruck that I couldn't even focus on what was happening, so we just went back to her bed and laid there with all the bats, and within the next 15 minutes, the noises stopped. What got me the most about this story is that when I woke up the next day, we went to the kitchen and asked Tana's mom about it, and to our shock she said, "I didn't hear anything. I slept like a baby last night." Tana and I stared blankly at each other in disbelief. I don't know if Tana and I are crazy or not, but I'm sure of what I heard, and so is she. Every time this story gets brought up, Tana and I brush it off and try to change the subject. I remember that Tana was the one looking through the blinds, not me. And that leads to the question that pops in my head every day. If I had looked, would I have seen something? I live in a very rural, mountainous area of California, and at the time I was working as a cook in a restaurant/bar. I was 24, and not in the best place financially at the time, so I had been borrowing my uncle's car to drive to and from work. I worked 5 p.m. to 11 p.m. I know everyone in this area well, and I don't have a single enemy. I get along with everyone. One night I had gotten done closing up the kitchen, and decided to have a beer before going home. The bartender was talking to a fellow community member and trying to get him to go home. He was too drunk for his own good. There were some out-of-towners that weren't too fond of the locals' demeanor, and it seemed like it was getting intense between them. I just saw it as a local that I knew being annoyingly drunk, but perfectly harmless. I had my beer and went out and got in the car. I could see inside the bar and spotted the local drunk, completely smashed. I felt bad for not offering him a ride, but was tired from work and told myself he'd be okay. I drive away. Mind you, there's no street lamps, no buildings. It's in the middle of nowhere. Pitch black. Quiet. I realize about a mile from the bar that I should turn around and offer the local a ride home. He didn't live far, and it wouldn't be far out of my way to do so. I turn around at a muddy turnout and go back. I get to the bar, and I basically was short with the local and told him that I would pick him up in the morning and he could get his truck, sober, and that I'll give him a ride home tonight. I was 24 at the time, and a small-built female. He was a smaller-built 35-ish looking male. I knew this guy had hit on me in the past, but I assumed he was just a 35-year-old weirdo who was lonely. I always just shrugged off his advances. Within a couple minutes of reasoning, he finally hopped in my car and I took off, driving towards his house, about 5 miles away on winding mountain roads. I didn't notice anything really at first. He seemed drunk, quiet, mumbly. But not too long into our drive, he starts saying thank you and how nice I am for helping him out. I say the usual, of course, no problem. I couldn't let him be there knowing full well that he wasn't able to drive. This is where I start getting creeped out. I make a turn onto the road he lives on. It's a long road, not many houses. All of the driveways are about a mile or two long, so you don't see any houses. He gets really quiet, and it's dark in the car. I can't see him really well. I notice him look at me though. I could see the reflection of his eyes from the dim lights on the radio. This is something I remember vividly. His eyes gleaming kind of green from the lights on the radio knobs. He was just looking at me. I, without returning his gaze, said, "What's up? Why are you looking at me like that?" He says to me, "You're so pretty, and I never get this chance to be alone with you." I shrugged it off, trying to play it cool, although I started regretting my decision. All of a sudden, he reaches over to me while I'm driving and tries to put his hand, I'm assuming, on my breast, but instead his hand lands on my shoulder/neck area. I start yelling at him to stop. I slam on my brakes in the middle of the road. No one is behind me. There's no one for miles. And I scream at him to get out of my car, now. And I repeat it over and over. At this point, I had my hands off the wheel and I was trying to push him out of my car. I had leaned over and opened the car door. I had never, in my life, realized my own strength. My own weak strength. This 30-something-year-old male was not budging against me. I noticed him laughing, a really sloppy laugh. He said, "You and I both know no one is around." I said to him, "We just left the bar. At least 5 people know where I'm going. Please stop. Here's a flashlight. Walk on home. I'm done with you tonight." He's quiet for a minute before saying, "I don't feel like walking much." The way he said it scared the living shit out of me. I started to scream. Not like a horse scream, but like an ear-piercing scream. I knew the scream was strong and loud, and I had even hurt my own ears, just hoping that someone had their windows open enough off in the woods. But nothing happened. We struggled for what felt like minutes as he kept trying to come at me. This entire time he was kind of laughing. He was drunk, so that was probably my only advantage. I was not. He was sloppy and trying to attack me for whatever reason. I pushed on him like I had never pushed on anything in my life. I pushed so hard that I felt my arms burning with pain. When he finally gets out of my car, I slam on the gas, not even bothering with the door. Remember, I was heading down a long-ass road in the middle of nowhere, and not on my road. It's a dead-end road after 20 miles, so I kept driving down this road I know well, knowing fully well that I will need to stop and turn around. But this road is like 1.5 lanes wide, and there's hardly any turnouts. When I finally do, I turn around fast and in someone's dirt driveway, afraid of the car being still for even a second. I take off driving, knowing he'll be up ahead any second. I never see him. I never see him again. He was a local I'd known for years and saw frequently. I don't know if he took off to another area from embarrassment or what, but I never saw him again. I arrived home, shaking, red, scratched, and out of breath. My boyfriend and our friend were at home playing Jenga, and I told them immediately. And they knew who it was too, and they went out to try to find him. And like I said, I never saw him again. And that was about a month ago. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you email it to yourmaker6260@gmail.com. I hope everyone's having a great day, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true.
Number 1.
This story is told from the point of view of a female. This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago when I graduated high school. I had grown up with my grandparents but decided to move to a different and much larger city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I somewhat knew the city already because I spent my summers with him, but this would be the first time I would have the freedom of an adult to come and go as I pleased, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes whenever I wanted. I was excited, though I was sad to leave all of my friends. As soon as I was settled in, my dad and stepmom sat me down to discuss a few rules and what I needed to know about the complex. Basic things like go wherever you want, but let us know when you leave and when you're coming back, even if it's 2 a.m. I had to park on the street because the apartment complex had limited parking, and they told me to watch out for the neighborhood creep. His name was George, and he was well known to all the women in the complex, as well as the police that patrolled the area. He was tall and fairly huge. He looked very intimidating. My parents were pretty certain that he would leave me alone for one reason: my dad. Though George had a habit of stalking women in the complex, he would stop and find a new Number 1. My brother had a creepy experience with a house during his time in Japan. He sent me an email of the story. Instead of rewording everything he says and giving it to you in a third-person perspective, plus I'm lazy, I'm just going to copy and paste it and let you read it. Hey, I don't mind you posting about the house. Just don't put my name or anything like that. Don't put yours either. And don't go to any chat rooms or Skype, ever. Chat roulette doesn't exist. I'm only kidding. You're still just a kid to me. Anyways, here it goes. I'll try to remember the best I can. I guess it all began when my friend Jesse started dating this Japanese girl named Chi. We were talking about watching a movie about a haunted house, and Chi didn't want to watch it. She said she knew of a real haunted house. She told us about the house on the cliffside in a dead forest. I know what you're thinking, not the suicide forest. She just meant all the animals there were dead or something like that. So we basically convinced her to take us there. Just me and Jesse at this point. She takes us on a drive that ends in the middle of nowhere, next to a trail in the woods. There was a little chain tied to 2 trees that wasn't doing much to keep people out, since it was dropped to about ankle height. All we had to do was step over it to enter the trail. Chi told us that she was staying in the car, and nothing we did could convince her otherwise. So me and Jesse head down the trail and walk for about 10 minutes until we got to the point in the forest where everything got silent. It's not like it was loud before. I didn't even notice the noises like the sound of crickets, birds, buzzing of insects, and things like that. When it becomes completely silent, it just hits you. There are no animals in that part of the woods. Me and Jesse just took one look at each other, and we both read each other's minds. We turned around and ran. We ran without stopping the whole way back. I didn't hear anything, but it just felt like something was chasing us. I beat Jesse to the end, and was almost in the car when I heard a thump and yell. I turned and saw Jesse on the ground. The chain rope that was ankle height had somehow caught him in the stomach. It left a mark and everything. I had to help him up, and we got out of there. But fuck that, we were getting to the bottom of this shit. So we got 4 more guys together, brought flashlights and guns, and went back. It was scarier in the dark, but with the other guys, we felt safe. We made it all the way to the end of the path this time. We knew that we were coming up on something near the water, because we could hear waves crashing against the cliff. Sure enough, when we got to the clearing, we were on the edge of a cliff. We were all facing a little house that looked like no one lived in it for at least 10 years. We went inside, and found that it looked like the family that lived there just disappeared. All of their belongings were tossed everywhere, but that could have been from people ransacking the place. I'm not sure. But it looked like clothes, dishes, and furniture were still there, just left behind and forgotten. The most alarming thing though, and the first thing you noticed, was the walls. The fucking walls. Every inch of the walls in every room was covered in ash, not just like painted in ashes either. It was covered in words written in ash in some weird language. Latin if I had to guess. It looked like someone dipped their finger in ash, then started at where the wall met the ceiling, and began writing something. Then when they got to the end of that wall, they made a new line right underneath. It continued until the wall met the floor, and they went to the top of the next wall. I can't imagine how much time that took. The creepiest thing is that Jesse told me that he asked Chi in private what she had heard about that house, and she told him that the legend says a mom who lived there went crazy one day and killed her husband and 4 children. She turned herself in and said she killed them and burned their bones. The bodies were never found, and the lady spent the rest of her life locked up in some asylum. It makes me wonder, though, about all that ash. How much ash would it take to cover your walls if you burned 5 bodies? Would that be enough? I don't know. Crazy shit. Anyways, I won't be able to sleep after thinking about it. Next time you send me an email, ask me about sunshine and rainbows. Number 2. When I was 12, my parents and I moved to another state. The house they chose was built in the 1960s by an architect who designed it himself. It was in the shape of a T, with the stem of the T being the large master bedroom. My bedroom being in the furthest left of the T, with also 2 living rooms separated by a kitchen also in the top of the T. The way to the front door of the house was to actually walk past a beautiful stained glass window that took up the entire east wall of my parents' bedroom and into the crook of the T on the right side. Needless to say, it was a weird house. It also had a basement. The basement had a deep freezer room, an office, and an incredibly creepy crawl space that opened up into a giant cavern of dirt piles as far as you could see with a flashlight. That pretty much made up the underbelly of the whole house. In the backyard was a giant slab of concrete that looked like it had been haphazardly added, apparently to fill in a pool. Now, I was 12, but I wasn't an idiot. This house was not child-friendly, and it was incredibly weird. It didn't help that my bedroom was so far away, and this house was so old and bizarre that if I yelled in my bedroom, you couldn't hear it from the other side of the house. Skip to night 1 in the new place. I hate it. I curled up in my little twin bed, trying to get used to the weird sounds and sights that the house has, and not really understanding why I was banished to this corner of the house where it was the coldest. The screen to one of my windows rushes in the wind from outside, and I take off running to my parents' bedroom. I slept in their bed that night. After a few nights of this, my parents finally decide I have to sleep in my own bed. No questions. I am given a little stuffed dog to keep me company, who I named Sherlock. I was kind of worried about him discovering bones in the basement. Of course, I ended up taking off running back to my parents' bedroom, and slept cuddled between 2 annoyed parents. Finally, my mom decides enough is enough. I can sleep in the room closest to the bedroom on a large chair. Now, this chair is right next to the basement door, and also to the back door. I agree to sleep in the big chair because I have never been allowed to before, and also, it's as close as I can get to my parents' bedroom without getting them upset. I throw a million blankets in a pile and nest onto the chair for the night. Surprisingly, Sherlock and I do seem to fall asleep quickly. At some point in the night, I wake up to what sounds like footsteps on the basement stairs, and the basement door is open. I scream so loud that my dad comes running out. He slams the basement door so that he has a clear view of me trying to become part of the furniture. "Why did you open this for? Are you trying to scare yourself?" "Dad, I didn't open the door. It was already open." At this point, my mom comes out to comfort me, but she doesn't seem at all calm. Her hands shake as she helps me get untangled from the blankets. She takes me to their bedroom and we fall asleep, albeit after a few bedtime stories. I wake back up to the sounds of more feet, this time on the carpet. I lie completely still and hope the noises stop, but then I heard whispering. I nudge my mom, and she just rolls back to her position. I then poke my dad's arm. Nothing. "Mom!" I whisper right into her ear. I then heard somebody whispering back at me from the dark.
No.
I scream loudly and clutch Sherlock to me, but neither of my parents moves. Something tries to grab my foot over top the blanket. I scream louder until my throat hurts. Both parents are still and breathing quietly. I stop screaming and listen, trying not to pant. I shake my mom. She is completely passed out. Giggling comes from the door by the bathroom, and I hear it creak open. The green clock numbers on the dresser glow against the door, so I can see it begin to move. As I remember it, the numbers actually start counting backwards, flipping slower and then faster and faster, until it was almost blinking. Two sunken eyes seem to glare at me from the corner, and I leap over my dad to the other side of the bed. The bedroom door is dead-bolted. My parents did this to make me feel safer, but now there's no way out. I hear the door bump against the dresser and I panic. I grab something heavy, it was a box or a book, off my dad's nightstand, and I throw it at the stained glass window, and it bounces off. Something grabs my foot and pulls me under the bed, where I fight and scrape and hit at the soft leathery thing that is trying to hold me down. I feel sharp pains, and I hear snuffling like a runny nose, and there was a flurry of limbs, almost like a giant spider. I finally connect with something hard enough to get out from under the bed. I threw the object again at the window, finally shattering it, and I ran out through the front gate into the street. I run for a long time, making sure whatever it was wasn't behind me anymore. I then don't really remember what happened after that. My parents told me they later found me curled up on a bench at the elementary school about a half-mile down the road. I had stained glass in my hair, a black eye, and my left arm was broken. I had numerous cuts and bruises around my ankles and neck. We moved out of that house as fast as possible, sleeping in a hotel until it was all packed up. The police believe I may have fought off an intruder who broke the stained glass wall to attack my parents. They had no other explanations to give me. The person I see for counseling says that as a child, I had to find something tangible to rebel against, since I was not happy about the move. The beautiful stained glass wall was the focal point of the house and was the easiest to fixate on, especially since my mother loved it and it was something really easy to destroy. The wounds I suffered were likely self-inflicted as I ran, possibly in a sleepwalking state, through the streets until I ended up at the school. However, when I asked my mom about that night, she said she was shaken too, because the basement door had a key lock on it, and only my dad had the keys. They were in his nightstand that night, and she had made sure to lock it because she was afraid I might go explore in the basement and fall down the stairs. She really has no idea how it opened. To this day, I still have night terrors of that thing with its dark pits for eyes, grabbing at my ankles and pulling me under the king-sized bed. I still don't know how my parents didn't wake up through all of the screaming. My therapist says I must have dreamt it, but I didn't dream of the glass breaking. Surely they would have heard that. Number 3. I grew up in Keeling, Missouri. No, you wouldn't have heard of it. It was a small, rural, upper-middle-class community where everyone owned at least an acre or two. My father was a writer, and my mom wanted to keep horses, so this was the perfect one-stoplight town to settle in. I grew up there until suddenly in 1984, the government claimed eminent domain on all of Keeling, and we were bought out. My dad then moved us to sunny California. I'm a writer too, though I'm not as well known as my father is. I write informational pieces for online magazines and blogs. As you can probably guess, I'm barely getting by. So when one of my editors asked me to write an article on eminent domain for a well-known political website, I jumped at the chance. She told me I was chosen because I had first-hand experience with eminent domain, and the buyer wanted a personal piece that included photos. I packed my bags that night, excited for the project. I'd always been curious about what became of my hometown. Anyway, before he died, My dad told me he thought Keeling had been turned into an airport. First, research. I was disappointed to find out that the internet was all but mute on the old town. Citing my sources was going to be difficult. I knew Keeling had been near Poplar Bluff, Missouri, so I pulled up Google Earth and followed 67 north to the turnoff for Keeling. Odd. The entire town was blank. Blank like there was a black gaping hole where Keeling used to be, a hole in the satellite data. I slammed my laptop shut and threw the mouse against the wall. This could only mean one thing. It was private and likely secret government property now. I hemmed and hawed on it for a few days before deciding to go anyway. This particular buyer had allowed me a per diem, funds for travel, and I might as well use them. Maybe there was still a story here. 2 days later, I was driving through Poplar Bluff in a rented Ford Focus. I stopped at a gas station for some water and granola bars, deciding to check into the hotel after I got back from Keeling. I was looking forward to seeing it again. I took the exit north on 67 and drove until I realized I had missed the turnoff. I circled back, looking for anything familiar. I drove back and forth until I found it. Barely there, covered in plant life and completely unrecognizable, was a road. I'd seen this street a million times, but never unpaved, which is why I had missed it. Someone had pulled up the asphalt and the road was completely overgrown. Bizarre. I drove the 6 miles into Keeling, wishing I had rented something with bigger tires and a higher clearance. Suddenly the pavement returned, and I rolled back into the abandoned business district of Keeling. It was small. A post office, a gas station, and a bar. All the buildings were derelict and rotting. Their decay far more consistent with something left sitting there for 100 years